All right, guys, here we go. We've got a really cool interview here for you guys. This is something that I've been wanting to do for a long time. Uh, you guys will know this guy from his work. So let's just start out. Duncan, thanks for being here.
Well, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, man, I tell you, this has always been my dream is to talk to you. Believe it or not, ever since I saw, let's see, this one right here. Heard
Oh,
that story. You
that was a
recognize that
while
deer?
ago. That was a great time.
Yeah, that was a great story. So I guess my first question is going to be to you. How did you get into hunting? How did that all start for you?
Well, nobody in my family hunted when I was growing up. I grew up on the outskirts of the Atlanta area, and nobody really in my family did much hunting. But from the time I was very small, I just had a real passion for going out in the woods, looking, studying the animals, the squirrels and the birds, and I wanted to hunt. And I started reading hunting magazines. And as I got into high school, I was very lucky. I had a few friends in high school whose fathers were real avid hunters, and they took me frequently on trips with them. And that's really how I got started.
That's what was the deer hunting like back when you were that age?
Well, in Georgia, there were no deer actually. When I was in high school in the early 60s, deer were the restocking program in Georgia started about in the mid 50s, really in earnest. And so by around the early 60s, they started having deer seasons in certain areas, and there were places where you could go hunt. But sometimes I would go probably the first 5 or 6 hunts I went on. I went to a place, a public refuge in central Georgia, and it was probably my sixth or seventh hunt before I even saw a deer in the woods.
Well,
So that's how rare they were at that time.
now how has that changed in Georgia since then? Is Georgia blown up?
Oh yeah, Georgia has since those days in the early '60s, the deer herd has just mushroomed, and the problem now is too many deer in a lot of places. So uh, management is real key to just trying to control numbers these days.
Yeah, definitely. Even here, even up in the Great North Woods, it's certain places are out of control, and certain places there's only 4 deer per
Yeah,
square
that's
mile.
one of the
So
ways. And we have places now, like for instance, in our North Georgia mountains, which are a lot like your terrain, your mountains in New Hampshire. The habitat is not real good. It doesn't support a lot of deer, so numbers up in our North Georgia mountains have really declined in recent years. And there's a lot of research going on now to try to determine what's happening and why numbers have gone down so much.
hmm yeah, a little bit of a different uh, point on that, but is it the same thing you're having problems with the turkeys in the same way?
Exactly. Yes. I don't know if you've heard any of that, but it's our turkey population statewide has really taken a nosedive in the last 5, 6, 7 years, and there's a lot of concern now about predators, coyotes, and bears, and we have a lot more black bears than we've ever had, a lot more coyotes,
Yeah.
and we've had a three gobbler limit
Yeah.
every year. And so they're trying to do some things now. I think they're going to probably make a few changes next year next spring to have, so you can only kill one turkey early season, maybe for the first month of the season. You can't kill two or three turkeys.
Wow.
So, and trying to increase the lifespan, I guess, of some of those gobblers that are out breeding with hens. And they're doing a lot of things, talking about reducing the limit.
hmm
And a lot of hunters really have voluntarily reduced the limit. Instead of shooting three turkeys like they've always done in the past, they'll just shoot one turkey. I know plenty of people who've been doing that recently.
Well, that just goes to show that us hunters are the true conservationists. So, as far as I can,
You're right, and hunters do care. If something goes wrong with the deer herd or the turkeys, they want to do whatever they can do to help make it right.
yep, I agree. So, how did you become a writer? That's the next question.
That's an interesting question. I was when I was in grammar school. I was in the third and fourth grade. I used to write little stories. I just wanted to write stories. I don't know. I would get these bird books. I was very interested in birds for a while. And I would get these bird encyclopedias, and then I would write a history of certain birds and just write it down and write a little story about it. And I always wanted to write stories. And growing up in high school, I did a great deal of reading. I read a lot of outdoor magazines. I guess like a lot of young kids growing up hunting, being interested in hunting. And I read a lot of the great writers, and I wanted to be just like them. And someday I wanted to write stories. And so that was sort of a goal that I had from an early time. And I did a few other things in my early life. And then finally, I just decided, but probably the late 70s or early 80s, I started writing really seriously. And I thought, it was really funny. I thought to be a writer, all you had to do is just write a book and, write a novel and send it to New York and get it published, and you'd be well on your way.
Yeah.
And so I did. I spent about a year writing a novel, and it was kind of a hunting-based novel based out in Colorado, hunting elk and mule deer. And it was kind of a love story type thing. And I thought it was great. And so I wrote it and got it finished, sent it to New York, and, waited for somebody to send me a big check. And I got about 15 rejections on that book. And, all they did was just reject it. And so I was talking to a magazine editor, and that actually these guys had started an outdoor magazine in Georgia called Georgia Sportsman Magazine. And it was a hunting and fishing magazine. And this was back in the late 70s. And I was talking to the editor one day, and he said, well, you're going about it the wrong way. What you need to do is write stories in magazines and get your name well known, and then write books. And, and then you can sell books a lot easier. So I said, well, that's great. I'd love to write some stories for you. So I started writing some deer hunting stories for Georgia Sportsman Magazine. And I was very fortunate. After a few years, the same people who owned Georgia Sportsman started North American Whitetail Magazine. Mm-hmm. And their office is only about 8 miles from my house. And so once I, got wind of they were going to start this new magazine, and I was kind of on the ground floor with them as a freelance writer. And so I actually had a story in the first issue of North American Whitetail, and I think it was the spring of 1983 edition, very first issue of North American Whitetail. The very first story in the magazine was a story that I wrote about hunting in Pennsylvania. And so I wrote a lot of stories for North American Whitetail over the years. And in the early 2000s, when everybody was getting into the TV production, doing TV shows, and Buckmasters had a show, and Realtree had a show, and anybody who had a magazine was getting into television. And so the editor of North American Whitetail, Gordon Whittington, was going to he was going to be involved, switch over to the TV production side, and they needed an editor. And they actually interviewed several people, but nobody wanted to, a lot of these, there were some great people they probably interviewed out in the Midwest, in Iowa and Kansas and places like that. But nobody wanted to move to Georgia and be an editor in Marietta, Georgia. So I think that was just kind of they got desperate, and they called me up one day and they say, hey, would you want to be editor of the magazine? And I had never gone into an office. I had never had a job where I had to work in an office before. And I didn't want to do it. I was afraid. I couldn't see myself having to get up and go to an office every day. And my wife, we talked about it, had a lot of long talks. And then finally she said, just give it a try. Give it a try for 6 months or a year. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. So I said, okay, I'll give it a try. And so I did. That was in 2004. I became editor of North American Whitetail, and I was editor there until about 2010, for about 6 years. And it was a great experience. It was hard work. I mean, it's, that kind of job is a 7-day-a-week job, and it's a way of life. I mean, you're out every day, out on the weekends doing something, and you're out getting stories all the time. So it really is a way of life more than just a 9-to-5 job. But I loved it, and got a lot of great experience. But over the years, the magazine changed hands a few times, and it got to where there were people in New York trying to, they were calling us up in Marietta, Georgia. For a long time, they left us alone, and we could just do whatever we wanted to do. And we had a pretty good magazine. And then they called up and they started saying, we want to do this and we want to do that. And I could sort of see the writing on the wall. So I decided to go back and start freelancing again, because writing books was really what I wanted to do. That was my real love, and that's what I wanted to do.
You've answered almost all my questions I was going to ask on that subject. So that's great. So in the magazine world, what is the biggest misconception? Not the magazine world, but the outdoor magazine world. What is the greatest misconceptions that sportsmen have about that magazine?
I think people, I'm not sure that I would say that they have misconceptions. But I think the magazine, wherever we went, it's, for instance, in Marietta, Georgia, where I live, I'm a nobody. But if I go to Kansas, and go to a sportsman's dinner, I'm a celebrity there because I work, I write for North American Whitetail. And so it really is sort of a status type thing that they build you up. And as editor and as a writer I've been involved in a lot of controversial stories as well. And so it's, people do kind of, I guess they love you or hate you, but if they love you, then you're kind of hero status with them in some ways.
Absolutely. I know I'm a local celebrity, we'll call it. People know you from the videos. People will find you and say, I know who you are. And it's foreign to me because I'm just doing this to teach people. But anyways, I know that with me, I've always loved the writings of like Ray Bergman, Peter Hathaway Capstick, Patrick McManus, of course, Jim Carmichael. All of those guys were the guys I read when I was growing up, that it just opened this huge new world to me. Because like you, my dad didn't hunt. My grandfather had passed. I had nobody to do that with. And those guys were the guys who were taking me hunting, even if it was on a page. So how did all of that, what you did as far as writing and everything, how did that lead you to the dawn of American deer hunting, excuse me?
I've always had a real interest and love for old things, for history. I'm a real history buff on, just early American history, the Western Indians, the Eastern Indian history. I love the American Indians. And I've always been very, very interested in old things from a historic standpoint. And when I started hunting as a teenager, I loved just the old stuff. I mean, if I went in a man's house and he had some old guns, I love those guns more than the state of the art, brand new stuff that was on the market. And I've always kind of been that way. And as I started writing stories, I did some historic stories, but I started collecting old photographs. And I take a lot of photographs. I've always been a photographer as well. And I started out trying to be a wildlife photographer and photograph deer and sell deer photos and things. And that was pretty competitive with some of the greats in this country. Mm-hmm. And I found out real quick, it's hard. You can't compete with Leonard Lee Rue, back in the 80s and 90s. And so I started collecting old photos wherever I could find them. I would go in somebody's house and the guy would show me an album and I'd say, can I get copies of these photos? Man, these are great. I just love them. Can I get some? And I would get copies, and I started collecting. And then when the internet came along and eBay came along and things like that, there were a lot of photos offered online that you could buy. And I started buying them. And I just, go online all the time and look at stuff and bid on it, and sometimes get some really old historic photos, but just the old camp scenes and old hunting scenes from Minnesota, Michigan, New York, the Adirondacks, everywhere, New England, up northern Maine. And so I started accumulating quite a few photos. And when I was editor at North American Whitetail, I did 3 or 4 stories with some of my old photos, and people really loved those stories. I got a lot of really good feedback with just the old stuff. And so after I left North American Whitetail, one day a package arrived in the mail, a brown manila envelope arrived in the mail. And my wife looked at me and she said, did you buy some more photos? And she kind of rolled her eyes. And I said, yeah. So we opened it up and there were a bunch of photos in there. And she said, what are you going to do with all these photos? And I said, I don't know. I just like to look at them. She said, well, why don't you write a book? And I said, a book with old photos? And I started thinking about that. And I thought, that's a great idea. I had never really thought about doing that. And so I started looking at some of the stuff I had. I had a lot of these old stereo view photos, which are 2 photos that you look at through a viewfinder, and just a lot of old things that are getting increasingly rare. You don't see them all the time now, nowadays. And so we started putting some stuff together, and I was very lucky. I had sent a few book ideas to Krause Publications, who published Deer and Deer Hunting magazine. And I was doing, after I left North American Whitetail, I was doing some writing for Deer and Deer Hunting. Yep. And they told me, they said, yeah, we're always looking for good book ideas. And they did a lot of they published a lot of great books. They did all the Larry Benoit books in the early 2000s. And they've done a lot of great deer hunting books on just celebrity deer hunters and just great deer hunters over the years. And how-to books on how to hunt, how to turkey hunt, different things like that. So they had a really good thing going. So I got this idea of just doing the old photos, and I submitted it to them, and they called me back immediately. They said, yes, let's do it. We want to do it. How quick can you do it? And I said, and this was probably in the spring, and I forget what year it was, like 2013, 14, something like that. And they said, if you can have us the book by the end of August, we'll have it out by Christmas. And so I had 90 days to do it. And we just dropped everything we were doing, and I started working on that nonstop. And we did it, got it done. And so that was the first volume of Dawn of American Deer Hunting. And it was just, it was a real hit with their readers. They reprinted it several times, and the book was very popular. So really made me feel good.
It still is in this house.
Well, thank you.
It gets looked at least 3 times a day.
They, as I said, they had reprinted the book several times, but they have since gone out of business, and they've been bought out by Random House. They're all their book holdings and things like that. And I've been trying to get the software so I could reprint that book, and it doesn't. You can't find it. I don't know what happened to it, but in their shuffle when they went out of business, a lot of stuff just disappeared, and so that book will probably never be reprinted again. And so
that's terrible.
That's kind of sad because it's done very well, and there's been a big demand for it. But then volume 2, I was doing some writing for Sporting Classics magazine, and
this one here, Duncan signed for me, so nobody's ever going to even touch this one.
So anyway, I got very fortunate to start doing some writing for Sporting Classics, which is kind of an upscale hunting and fishing magazine published out of Columbia, South Carolina. And so they have kind of a Southern theme, but they do a lot of old stuff. They love to do old stories about tiger hunting and, Ernest Hemingway fishing and just a lot of the old stuff. And so the editor there I really hit it off with him very well. And we started talking, and I showed him volume 1, and I said, I really want to do a volume 2. And he said, well, let's do it. And so we did. And that's done very well. So now we're working on volume 3, and we're just about finished with volume 3. It'll be out in about, well, I'll be sending it in to the publisher in about a month.
Speaking of which, Diane is going to go and get that picture back from my brother. She's actually going to make a copy this time because I'm tired of grabbing it from him, and we will send that to you.
Oh, that would be great. Well, I would love to have that. That's a great photo, a great story, and that's the kind of stuff that I love to have in the book. If you can really, put a person's name with the photo and a real person who actually lived, and especially somebody like your grandfather who influenced you and did a lot of hunting in New Hampshire. And so it'd be an honor to have his picture in the book. We
actually have another photo that we're trying to find of a bigger buck than that I think it's a 7-pointer, and that is actually a bigger one. I think it's that 12-pointer right there that he has hanging in a tree with the same rifle, which I have in the other room, which we're going to restore it. I don't like restoring my Winchesters, but that one's very special, so it's going to get put back to original condition. So that's well, that's great. Awesome. That is great. That heritage that you have is so special. To have a grandfather like that who influenced you and, who hunted back in those days. Yeah, he would tell us stories about back then, the deer hunting that they did. It wasn't during the rut. It was later. I think if I remember correctly, we used to have a bunch of his old licenses, and I wish I could send those to you so you could see those, but I don't even have them anymore. I believe that the deer season for rifle was during December and January. And the stories my mom would tell us about him out tracking a buck in waist-deep snow. I mean, it just fueled the fire to do what we do. I'm sure. So it's just, he died when I was, I think 8 or 10. Yeah. So we didn't really get the chance. It would have been nice if you could have known him during your teenage years when you were really starting to get out. Yeah, most definitely. I mean, I still have, I have one rack of his, the only one he ever kept. If you want to grab that, we'll show that. It's the only deer rack he ever kept of a deer, and it's not super big, but it must have held some specialness to him because he always said the antlers were only good for stirring soup. So let's see, over the years it broke, so we had to. Wow, that's a nice rack. Yeah, it scores about 140, so I mean it's not bad. It was actually this buck was shot in Woodsville, New Hampshire, 1938. Wow, beautiful deer. That's I bet there's a great story behind that. Yeah, I'm sure. I wish I knew it. I mean, that was hanging on the wall with just the writing on the back of the wood. Woodsville, New Hampshire, 1938, and that was all. That's pretty much all I know about it. But yeah, I would have loved to be in his hip pocket just for a couple of hunts. Oh, that way I know those, and that's what and so going back, that's one thing I love about Don doing these stories. With each photo is a story in itself, and you can, and a lot of, if you have some information, you can tell the story. So those are the kind of photos I love the best, where you can really tell a true story and you can just kind of put yourself there. And then you imagine too, well, how did he do this? And how did he do that? And it's just, to me, and going back but just looking at those pictures and looking at the faces in those pictures and thinking, this was a real breathing, living human being, just like me. He was out there in the cold snow, walking through the woods, trying to stay warm and trying to find a buck. And but that was 100 years ago. He was doing the same thing I'm doing today. Yep. And it is special. And that, I guess, to me, that's one reason why our history is so special in so many aspects, not just deer hunting, but all history, the Civil War history, everything. Yep. And when people are trying to destroy our history, it's just so hard to understand how people can say, we want to just, eradicate history. They're bound to repeat it if they do it. Yeah. That's about all I can say about it.
But
Yeah.
New England too. Getting back to the photos, it's so funny. What I quickly found out when I was collecting photos is a lot of photos were taken in Maine, in the New England area, and the Adirondacks, because there were always photographers around those areas.
Yep.
And a lot of the immigrants who came into communities, they'd always have a photographer that would take pictures. And a lot of them would just go out to deer camps and take deer camp photos. And so when they started going from say New York, when they immigrated into New York, families would move on to Michigan and Minnesota and the upper Midwest. Same thing there. All those little communities always had a photographer, and they knew how to take great pictures.
Mm-hmm.
And so many pictures have been saved and come down from those areas. In the South, you can't find any pictures. Nobody had a camera. In the South, it's funny. Nobody could afford a camera, so nobody took any pictures. So they're very few and far between.
I was going to say, the ones that you find that are from the South, from Texas or any of those places, those are the ones that are more rare, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Harder to find. Yeah.
Yeah,
they're great. I mean, some of the pictures in the book, you look at the picture and you just wish you could be there to listen to what was going on. And you can hear the bantering going on in the deer camps and all the shenanigans that were happening. It's
exactly. And
amazing.
Even in those days, like in Georgia, in the first deer hunt they had in the North Georgia mountains was in 1940. And I talk about it a little bit in volume 2 and have some photos. And it was a media event. And when they had this 5-day deer hunt, they actually had a 5-day archery hunt first, and then they had a 5-day gun hunt, and they had live radio up there from Atlanta, broadcasting radio. This was in 1940. It was such a huge event. And then, the newspaper, they had these great photographers, and the newspapers would go up there and take fantastic photos. And so a lot of those photos have survived.
Yeah. There was a couple of pictures in there of the people being interviewed in the book.
Yeah.
And the guy was like, they're so proud to be interviewed about this deer. I mean, it's a huge, huge event in their life to actually be able to do that at that point in time. So I don't know, the book brings back the life of yesteryear. And to me, that book just fuels everything that I do. That book had a lot to do with how I went about doing this channel, is showing that these old ways are the ones that work the best. So let's get back and do it. So that's how we track, we still hunt. There's a few of the guys in my little group here that like to sit in a tree and shoot stuff with a bow, but I'm more traditional as far as going back into the old ways, old guns, old clothes, just trying to do it that way, the traditional style.
And I'm with you all the way. That's the way to do it. I just love it. I love the idea of hunting that way, and there's so much romance to that. Those guys were just hard hunters, and they suffered when they didn't have all these warm clothes that they could wear. These warm insulated boots and things. They just went out there and froze to death. But they loved what they were doing, and they suffered, and they got through it, and they killed a lot of deer too.
Oh yeah, a lot of military surplus you see in those. You see a lot of the World War I gaiters on.
You see a lot of that in a lot of the photos. And I mentioned that in some of the photos that I'll say he's got a World War I leggings, or maybe a hat or boots, those lace-up boots, things like that they brought back from the war.
I guess they figured if they could make it through World War I or II, that they probably could take out a deer. Mm-hmm. It wasn't going to be as hard, and probably a little more relaxing than what it was. My grandfather, he was a World War II vet. I
remember you sending me that, telling me that when he left to go to. He was a combat engineer?
Absolutely. I can't remember the unit. I do have all that information at my parents'. I have a book about that thick of just his pictures that he sent back. And online, there's actually, if I can remember the battalion, there's a whole history of his battalion, what they did day for day. And his unit was the first one to put a pontoon bridge across the Rhine River under fire, and he got the Bronze Star for that. So another great story to go with all that is he came back, started a family, and deer hunted with his brother. So that was his way. That was his relaxation, other than running a forklift at the mill. So yeah, so it's all history is what we are, 100% down to our core is what our forefathers have lived and how we express it today.
So true. You know, good or bad, it's what we are. And we learn from our mistakes and we try to do better.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I think historically, this country has done so much good for the world, not just for its people, but for the world in general. I mean, no country in the world has done as much as the United States. So
no,
we're very lucky to be Americans.
We even gave Finland whitetails. I think that was the greatest gift we could have gave the world at that point in time.